Good evening, everyone. And thank you very much to Harvey and the people for Pittwater for having me tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here. Today is the 26th of June, and we stand here 2 days before the close of submissions on the white paper and the planning bills. And I have to say, I feel a little bit emotional tonight because this is the last presentation that I will be doing, the last of about 25 to 30 presentations that the Better Planning Network has given all over the state. And also, it reminds me how far we have come since we formed in August last year, because it's almost a year since we formed. And it's been a lot of hard work, but I have to say that it's just totally worth it standing here and having been asked to come and speak tonight. So, thank you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Better Planning Network, quickly, and then I'm going to try and give you a summary of the white paper and, most importantly, of the planning bills. Because the white paper, which is this document here, and is meant to be the plain English version of what is being proposed, will shortly become completely irrelevant. And what will stay with us for many, many years to come is the two planning bills, the Planning Bill 2013 and the Planning Administration Bill 2013. And the reason I draw a distinction between those two documents, the white paper and the legislation, is because they tell completely different stories. The white paper is essentially the story that the government wants people to hear. And it's a story of community empowerment and community engagement in planning, and a simpler planning system. What the planning bill reveals is that there is no substance to this story. And in fact, many components of what is being proposed in the planning bills go directly against the claims being made by government. So, without further ado, I'll tell you a little bit about the BPN. We're a grassroots organisation that was established at the end of August 2012 as a response to community concerns about the Green Paper. The Green Paper being the document that was released before the White Paper came out. So it was a draft document, draft proposals as such. We started out originally in the North Shore and Ryde area of Sydney with about 20 community groups. We are not aligned with any political party, and we are volunteer-based. So any funding that we get is actually from our affiliated groups and individuals. We do not accept funding from political parties. And just clarifying as well, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by Better Planning Network later on in the talk. But what we don't mean is we do not have an anti-development stance, we do not have an anti-growth stance, we do not have an anti-densification stance. We have a wide range of groups that we are affiliated with, and we work on the common ground between those groups. And the common ground is a planning system that is driven by ecologically sustainable development principles, that has community well-being at its heart, that protects community input into local planning and development decisions, and that protects our environment and heritage. We also want a planning system that minimizes risks of corruption. Essentially, these are the pillars of what we stand for and what we are actually working towards. So where we are today, we actually have, as of today, 410 community groups across New South Wales, and the sort of community groups that are joining us are very diverse in nature. We're talking about environmental groups, heritage groups, a lot of progress associations, community associations, resident groups, local historical societies, as well as main groups such as, or peak groups, such as the Royal Australian Historical Society, the Royal Australian Garden Society, the Nature Conservation Council, the Total Environment Centre, the National Parks Association of New South Wales. We've got a strong online presence, and if you're on Facebook, we encourage you to like our page. We've got a fast-growing email database reaching into many local communities. And I have to say that our strength, many people assume that the strength of the Better Planning Network is that we have 410 affiliates. And that's actually not where our strength lies. The reason we've been able to achieve what we have achieved is because we can reach into local communities and empower individuals and groups to apply pressure within their local communities to their local media on their local MP. This is why this is working. So it's not a matter of me or anyone else at central level going around and saying, you know, we've got 410 affiliated groups and won't you listen to us? That's not making the difference. What's making a difference is that government can see that our affiliated groups are actually willing to be active in their own local area. And that demonstrates the significance of the concern that is in our local communities. And that's why we're actually getting listened to. So we've got increasing media coverage and a major campaign on the New South Wales Planning Review. So where we've come from in terms of the New South Wales Planning Review, the O'Farrell government was elected on an election promise in its contract with New South Wales to return planning powers to local communities. And upon getting into government, one of the first things that happened is that Minister Hazzard appointed 2 gentlemen to conduct a very thorough independent review of the planning system. These gentlemen were Mr. Tim Moore, a former Liberal minister, and Mr. Ron Dyer, a former Labor minister. And I don't know if anyone of you remembers, but these gentlemen went around the state and conducted extensive consultations with a whole range of stakeholders. And they came up with a final report in June 2012, in which they made 374 recommendations for reforming our planning system. 1 month later, the government released its response to this independent review in the form of a green paper. But the green paper was something completely different from what Moore and Dyer had actually recommended in their independent review. Sure, it picked up on some aspects, such as the move to strategic planning, but it left out a lot of the checks and balances that can actually contribute to a balanced and fair New South Wales planning system. And it's around the stage of the Green Paper that the Better Planning Network actually came together. There was 8-week consultation on the Green Paper, and the Green Paper was released just before the local government elections, which effectively prevented many councils from actually informing their community and consulting with their communities on the Green Paper. There were hundreds of submissions made on the Green Paper, hundreds of community submissions. But when the White Paper came out in April this year, we very quickly realised that the gist of these community submissions had been ignored. The White Paper submissions on the White Paper will close in 2 days' time, and we then move into the next stage of the planning review, which is the enacting of planning legislation in the Parliament. The government has said that it wants to enact the new planning legislation in the spring session of Parliament, which will be around September this year, could be a little bit later. But we're looking at having completely new planning legislation by the end of the year. It's very important to understand that our current planning legislation, which is the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, which has been in place for over 30 years, will actually be completely repealed by the new planning bill. And all of the planning instruments that we know, such as the SEPs, the State Environmental Planning Policies, the local environmental plans that we're familiar with, all of these will eventually be repealed. There'll be a transition period, but eventually they will be repealed and be replaced by new planning instruments under the new regime. So I'm going to start talking about the bill now. When you look at a bill, it's very, very important to look at the aims of the bill, the objects of the bill. Because the objects of the bill are crucial in guiding decision makers to make decisions, both in terms of strategic planning and development assessment. When we look at the bill, we notice 9 objects. The first thing we'd notice is that there is no overarching object for the bill. There's a series of 9 objects, and some of these objects actually conflict, which makes it very difficult for decision makers to actually have adequate guidance. And that is the first thing that goes against recommendations by Moore and Dyer. Moore and Dyer said that the new planning bill should have an overarching objective of ecologically sustainable development. Not only we don't have an overarching objective, but we don't have ecologically sustainable development either. And the wordings that you see, the words that you see on the screen, actually are the words of the first object of the act, of the bill. Economic growth and environment and social well-being through sustainable development. Now, 2 observations about that object. Economic growth, you see, is up front. Now, it's very important to understand that this is a radical departure from our current planning legislation, and it's actually quite a novel concept to have economic growth as one of the key objects of your bill, because planning is much broader than economic growth. The second thing that you notice is that there is mention of sustainable development, but the definition given of sustainable development in the planning bill is a completely, radically different definition to what is currently in our planning legislation and in over 60 New South Wales pieces of legislation. And this definition excludes 3 key internationally recognized principles of sustainable development. The first principle that it excludes is the principle called the precautionary principle. Some of you may have heard of that term. For those who haven't, the precautionary principle is essentially a principle that says if you don't have sufficient data to determine what the environmental impacts of a particular decision is going to be, then you hold off that decision. Now, that principle, which is in our current planning legislation and in over 60 New South Wales statutes, has been ripped out of the proposed planning legislation and the definition of sustainable development. The second thing that's been removed from the definition is the principle of the conservation of biological diversity and ecological integrity. The third principle that's been removed is commonly referred to as the polluter pays principle. That's the idea that whoever is responsible for the environmental impacts associated with any development should actually be responsible for mitigating those impacts. Those 3 key principles are not referred to in the planning bill. And what that means practically is that the definition of sustainable development that is being proposed is much, much narrower and much weaker than the current definition that we have. Now, the combination of this with the fact that economic growth is driving a new planning system will lead to all sorts of decisions which do not fit within the framework of ecologically sustainable development. Enhancing people's quality of life, or enhancing residential amenity, or enhancing community well-being, or enhancing the quality of our built environment, none of those things are included as objects. Climate change does not exist. It's not mentioned. So even if you don't, believe that, climate change is human-induced, there are still scientifically expected impacts of climate change that any responsible planning system would be expected to address. Rising sea levels would be one. Climate change is not mentioned in this planning system. So I'll now move on to what's actually proposed, how this new system is going to work. And the first thing I'll say is that the biggest shift from the way we do things at the moment is in terms of community engagement and where community actually gets engaged. At the moment, most of you will know that the way most people come into contact with the planning system is when they have a development go up next door or in their street and they want to comment on that development. So this is the main way that community actually engages. The government wants to remove the right of comment on up to 80% of development applications and replace that with increased community engagement at strategic planning level. Now, what is strategic planning? Strategic planning is when you look at all the land that is available within a particular region or a sub-region or a local government area, and you make decisions as to how this land is going to be used based on the evidence and on the wishes of the various stakeholders residing within this area. So government wants to increase community engagement upfront, as it refers to it, upfront at strategic planning level, and remove community engagement on up to 80% of development applications. Now, there's nothing wrong with increasing community engagement at strategic planning level. But let's not kid ourselves. Strategic planning already exists under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. It's just never been done properly because there's never been enough resources to do it properly. But what we found over the years is that people find it very difficult to engage at strategic planning level. Most people only engage when development actually affects them directly. And the government has said that engaging, and has recognized that engaging people effectively in strategic planning is going to be a real challenge for them. But they have said several times that they've got no idea about how they're going to do it effectively. Yet, they are proposing to remove the safety net of comment on development applications. So what's it all about? Let's look at what's being proposed at strategic planning level. You remember how I talked about the strategic planning instruments such as local environmental plans and regional plans that are going to be repealed under the new system? Well, these are the things that are actually going to replace them. We've got 4 levels of strategic planning instruments. At the very top, we've got the state planning policies. Now, these will be very broad, statewide policies that will determine how, what priorities strategic planning has to address. We don't know what the policies are going to be because they haven't told us yet. In principle, the white paper says that the planning policies should involve community consultation. They'll be prepared by the New South Wales Government and made by the Minister. So the Minister will have final say on these policies. Next level down, we've got the regional growth plans. The regional growth plans will set targets and a vision for a particular region. Now, you might know that the regional growth plan for Sydney has actually been released. It's called the Draft Metro Strategy for Sydney. And the submissions on that also end in 2 days. Now, the thing to note here is that the Metro Strategy has been released, but very few people are actually aware of the strategy. And it is being conducted without the New South Wales planning policies having been set and without the community engagement that's been promised in the white paper. And I think that we can safely say that there's a reason why the Metro Strategy is being rushed through. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of slides, but bear that in mind. Under the regional growth plan, you'll have the sub-regional delivery plans. So these plans will actually implement what's being decided in the regional growth plans, and they will start to rezone key areas of land. So they might decide, for instance, that a particular area of land needs to be protected. Piece of urban bushland, for instance. On the other hand, it might decide that another area of land needs to be a high-density precinct. So you're seeing key zoning decisions starting to be made at the sub-regional level. The sub-regional plans will be prepared by a entirely new board called a sub-regional planning board, which will consist of a representative from each council within the sub-region, 4 ministerial appointees that are state representatives, and 1 chairperson appointed by the Minister with the concurrence of Local Government New South Wales. Now, these boards will consult with community and will prepare the sub-regional planning instruments. And these instruments will then be made by the Minister. Right at the bottom of the ladder, you have the local plans. Now, the local plans will be prepared by your council and will essentially replace your existing local environmental plans. The local plans will include zoning, of course, and they'll also include something new called the local code. The local code will be very detailed prescriptions of what kind of development can occur where in the local government area. And we're being told by the white paper that community will have significant input into the preparation of the local code. Now, the thing to note here is that each plan has to be certified by the authority that prepares it as complying with the plans above it. So it's a very top-down approach. By the time you get to your local plan, major zoning decisions have already been made at sub-regional planning level. And the sub-regional planning instruments depend in large part on the regional growth plans. Bear in mind that the draft metro strategy is about to be made for Sydney. So the government has said to us that they want to increase community engagement at strategic planning. And they've recognised that this is going to be a huge challenge. So how are they actually going to ensure meaningful community engagement in strategic planning? Their main proposal is to implement a community participation charter. The community participation charter is essentially a list of 7 very broad principles of good community engagement, things like openness and transparency, early upfront participation, that sort of thing. The problem is that nothing in the community participation charter is actually enforceable. So under the community participation charter, councils, the Director General, the Sub-Regional Planning Board have to prepare community participation plans. But if they decide that they're not going to actually follow that plan, and they're actually not going to consult with community at all, or maybe they're going to do just minimal community consultation, then the bill explicitly says that community or anyone else has no right to challenge that in the courts. So essentially, the community participation charter is very much a toothless tiger. It's a guide. The only aspect of community participation which is mandated in the bill is the requirement for draft strategic plans to be exhibited for 28 days, for a minimum of 28 days. Nothing else is actually mandated. There are, I think, additional mandated exhibition periods for various proposals, but that's the only aspect of community engagement which is actually mandated and that you can actually take to court if they're not adhered to. Sean. I've already gone through who prepares and makes strategic plans, so I might actually pass that slide, thank you. The other thing to note is that, and this is very, very important, this is probably the most important slide in my entire presentation. Even if, let's say, that we've got excellent community engagement in strategic planning, and we end up with plans that are acceptable to communities, you know, not exactly what we want, but we can live with them. The thing is that the planning bill provides for a number of ways in which those strategic planning controls that have been agreed to with community, that community has had input into, the bill provides a number of ways in which these strategic planning controls can be disregarded. And I'm now going to tell you about these various ways. The first is that the minister, as he does now, will continue to be able to amend any strategic plan at any point in time, with or without community consultation. Again, the planning bill specifically excludes anyone from taking that decision, from challenging that decision in the courts. The second way, I'll just leave the second point for later, we'll go to the third point. The second way in which strategic planning controls can be disregarded is through spot rezonings. So developers and landowners will continue to have the right to ask for spot rezonings of their land to council. If the council rejects their proposal, they will be able to apply for a review of the decision by an independent panel. There are no equivalent rights of review for anyone in the community. The third way that strategic planning controls can be disregarded under the new planning system is through state significant development. So as happens now, the minister will continue to have broad discretions to declare any particular development state significant development. There is one difference between what is being proposed and what is happening now. With state significant development today, you can actually challenge the decision in regards to particular state significant development by taking it to the courts if you think that the act has been breached. The new planning system removes that right. So there will not be any way that you can challenge state significant development decisions by the minister in courts. I'll come back to my second point, strategic compatibility certificates. Now, this is something very new being introduced in the new planning system, and they are Division 4.7 of the bill, if anyone wants to read the bill. I really recommend you read this section. For me, it was the most shocking section of the whole bill. It's 2 pages long, and I highly recommend that you read it. The theory goes like this. It's going to take years for councils to update their existing local environmental plans to local plans. And I think, the expectation is that it would take up to 5 years. In that time, the government wants to have a way of getting on with business. And it's proposing to do that through strategic compatibility certificates. What essentially those certificates are is a way for developers to apply directly to the Director General of Planning for a certificate that effectively rezones their land. This can only happen if a regional growth plan or a sub-regional plan have been made under the new system. Do you remember I mentioned the draft metro strategy and why I thought they were rushing it through? I have come to the conclusion that the reason the government is rushing through the regional growth plan for Sydney, which is the draft metro strategy for Sydney, is because as soon as the metro strategy is made by the minister, which is a matter of months away, developers under the new planning system will have the right to request strategic compatibility certificates from the Director General. Let me tell you a little bit about those certificates, a little bit more. There's only 4 issues that the Director General needs to take into consideration to grant strategic compatibility certificates. These cover the need for the proposed new rules for the piece of land to be compatible with the regional growth plan. Okay? That's fairly easy because regional growth plans are very broad. I mean, you can pretty much claim that anything's compatible. And the other big consideration that the Director General has to take into account relates to the future, the fact that the rezoning, equivalent of a rezoning, it's not called a rezoning, but the rezoning, for lack of a better word, cannot affect the future use of surrounding land. Okay? He doesn't need to take into account any environmental impact, any community amenity impacts, any traffic impacts, any visual impacts, any heritage impacts. He can grant that certificate with or without community consultation. He has to consult with councils and the regional panels, but he doesn't have to take their opinions into account. Once the certificate is granted, the developer can then go to their local council and put in a proposal for a development based on the new rules for their land. The development is assessed on merit, which means that community consultation might occur at the development assessment stage. However, the council cannot refuse the development if the refusal is on the grounds of conditions that have been covered by the strategic compatibility certificate. To translate that into a practical example, you live in a low-density area. Developer comes around, has got a piece of land. He or she decides that they want to apply for a strategic compatibility certificate for medium density development. 4 stories, 5 stories. They put in for a certificate from the Director General. Director General approves the certificate. Development application goes to council. Council assesses the application on merit. And it decides that it doesn't want medium density in this area because this area is low density. It can't do anything about it. It cannot refuse the application on the basis that it's a medium density proposal because the Director General has already said that he's changing the rules. For me, as a Sydneysider, this is probably the most immediate danger associated with the planning bill. So we've talked a lot about strategic planning. And in summary, to summarize that section, I want to say 2 things. The Community Participation Charter is not mandatory. Therefore, the extent of community consultation and the quality of community consultation that will occur in strategic planning will vary greatly between areas. And we cannot count on it. The second point I'd like to make is that even if the community engagement is a good process, there are a variety of ways in which the strategic planning controls can be disregarded over time and overruled. As well as being a problem with community, the BPN's position is that this is a problem for corruption. The discretions given to the Director General, who has no tenure, by the way, the Director General is on contract, and to the Minister are very, very broad. It leaves a lot of flexibility in their hands. Now, ICAC has said that flexibility and broad discretion powers are a huge problem in terms of increasing risks of corruption. So I'm now going to talk about the development end of the process. You've ended up with your strategic plans, and here you are, you've got a development going up next door. What are your rights? There'll be 5 categories of development, and the government argues that what is being proposed is simpler than what we already have. But the reality is that it's not simpler at all. If anything, it's a little bit more complex. You'll keep the category, the stream called prohibited development. And prohibited development is development that you cannot carry out in a particular zoning. I forgot to say something about strategic compatibility certificates. The Director General can rezone the land even if the development that would result from the rezoning is currently not permissible, is prohibited development within the local environmental plan. Okay? Forgot to mention that bit. So the first section is prohibited development. The second is exempt development. So this is development such as a fence in a residential area that you don't need to put a development application for. The third category is called complying development. Now that category already exists in our current system, and it's already causing problems. But the government wants to expand this category to include fairly major developments, such as, for instance, a new 2-story house. What would happen with complying development is that the developer would take their plans to a certifier. That certifier could be privately employed, so the developer could pay them directly, or they could be council employed. The certifier would look at the plans and look at the criteria for complying development. If the plan complies, he'll tick the boxes and have to approve it in 10 days or less. You will have no right of comment. You will receive a courtesy letter saying that the development has been approved. The fourth stream of development being proposed is a new stream. It's called code-accessible development. Do you remember that I talked about in the local plan that there will be a new element of the local plan called the code, the local code? The local code will determine what kind of development is code-accessible and the criteria for this kind of development. There will be no floor space ratios anymore. It'll just be a series of performance-based criteria that will determine what development has to comply with to be code-accessible development within a particular area. Code-accessible development will be assessed by council in 25 days or less. You will have no right of comment. You will simply receive a courtesy letter saying that a code-accessible development has been approved. And code-accessible developments would include major developments such as residential flats, an addition to a house in an existing heritage conservation area, 20 or less townhouses or row houses, new commercial premises, land subdivisions, so fairly major development. The last category will be merit-assessed development, and that covers developments such as state-significant development, regionally significant development, what is now known as designated development, which will be called EIS development, EIS-assessed development in the new system. Now, the important thing to understand is that government has said that within 5 years they want 80% of development to be complying or code accessible. At the moment, we've got about 20% of developments that are complying or code accessible. Sorry, that are complying. We don't have code accessible at the moment. So it's a complete turnaround of what we actually have at the moment. The other important thing to understand is that complying and code-accessible development will not be assessed on merits. They're what is called tick-the-box development. As long as they satisfy some preset criteria, they will have to be approved. Council will not have the choice to refuse them if they comply with certain criteria. Most of our developments today, in fact 80%, are not tick-the-box development, they're merit-assessed developments. So when a development, most developments that go to council today, council will look at them and say, oh, well, you know, how about the traffic impacts? And how about the visual impacts? And how about the impacts on the neighbor? None of that under the new system. Tick-the-box development. So the white paper proposals are not the answer from our point of view. And one thing I want to say as well, quickly, before I sum up, is that the government's very proudly said that there's been no reduction in judicial review rights. Let me take a moment to explain to you what judicial review rights are. There are two ways at the moment that a third party, so someone from the community, can take a particular development to court. A development can be taken to court because it is believed that that development, that the decision regarding that development has breached the Act. That's judicial review. And then a development can be taken to court on the argument that, on the argument of its merits. So for instance, the traffic impacts are too great and that development will cause chaos in the community. Or that particular development will have, you know, an unacceptable impact on a threatened species. Okay? So two ways of taking developments to court, taking decisions to court at the moment. The government is mostly not changing anything to merit appeal rights, although the only types of developments that you'll have merit appeal rights are EIS assessed developments. You won't have appeal rights on normal, you know, residential flats or whatever, okay? But that's not different from the situation now. But there is a huge reduction in judicial review rights, and the government will not admit to it. But if you read the planning bill, clause 10.12, it is very obvious that the government is removing the right to judicial review on a number of decisions. And these decisions include the Community Participation Charter, strategic planning decisions. At the moment, you can take a decision on a local environmental plan to court. You won't be able to do that in the new system. You cannot take the decision to issue a strategic compatibility certificate to court. You cannot take the decision to issue a spot rezoning to court. All right? Clause 10.12 in the bill removes that right. And that is a huge reduction in a basic safeguard to protect us from corruption. Decision makers tend to make decisions in a very different way when they can be taken to court. And ICAC has recommended that in fact the best way to guard against corruption is to have merit appeal rights on every decision. But instead of that, we've actually got a reduction in judicial review rights. So obviously, from our point of view, the white paper proposals are not the answer. Too large a focus on economic growth, an over-reliance on community engagement at early strategic planning level, the removal of residents' rights to comment on 80% of DAs, a top-down approach, increased risks of corruption, and it's an unfair and unbalanced system. And that's basically what our campaign is trying to change. What's our vision? I've already talked a little bit about that. A planning system that is driven by ESD principles, has community well-being in its heart, enhances community amenity, quality of life. Isn't that what planning should be about? Conserves and protects our environment and heritage, promotes an equal relationship, at least an equal relationship. Someone told me I was being very generous. Promotes an equal relationship between developers and the local community, and minimizes risks of corruption. And that's all. So thank you very much for listening.